It is now 10 o'clock, so we're going to get this meeting started and on time. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone out in the audience as well. It is August 22nd, 2023. Mr. Duncan, good to see you this morning. And second on the agenda, we have the approval of the previous meeting minutes, and the floor is open for a motion for the approval of those minutes. Okay, we got a motion by Councilmember Wu, seconded by Ms. Worth. Do we want to raise our hands for all in favor? Okay, motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. Thank you all for being here today. Again, this is our third meeting, and so what we want to do today is sort of bring together the information that we've been discussing for the past two meetings with the possibility of start working on a map to address the expansion of the urban service area. We have our GIS support here to help with that. We also have Charlie Martin and Beth Overman here as well, who spoke to you last week if we need to clarify anything about that. And we've provided a PowerPoint to you that we'll be showing here in just a moment to bring you all up to date on where we are and to help move us to the next step. Remembering that we are on a very, very fast timeline. And so we have dedicated this meeting and the next meeting, and I believe one more, is that right, Chris Taylor, to building the map, as we're calling it. And then we'll follow that with a public input meeting in the evening, and then come back and finish this work. So it's moving quite quickly, and you all have been very, very generous with your time and with your interest in this project. So to bring us back up to kind of to where we were when we finished up last week, and to set us up for our next step, you will recall that Charlie Martin, Director of the Division of Water Quality, presented the areas of sewerability, essentially the sewerability study. It's still being finalized. The consultants who worked on that are here with us as well, but enough of it is finished so that we can begin reviewing our work today. And that map, the areas of sewerability become very important because that becomes the basis, really, for applying the other criteria that the council set in order to consider an expansion. So it gives some order to our work by providing a specific geography to work from, and then it's also consistent with the decades of policies of this government to provide urban services where infrastructure can be provided. So this is consistent with the urban service area policy. It's consistent with sewerability reviews in the past, and so what we're looking at is geography based on sewerability with an analysis of that, and then applying the criteria that council said in order to get us to the point that we can start making decisions. So as a reminder, in addition to the infrastructure requirements, the council also directed us to look at transportation corridors when we're considering expansion of the urban service area, and to recognize the integrity of our agricultural land. So we've got a number of inputs that inform that. And so what we've done is taken those recommendations, or those requirements from council, the sewerability study, and put those together in a ranking, really, to allow us to order these sewerability areas in a way that we can demonstrate how they meet the criteria. That doesn't mean necessarily that those are the areas that you have to choose or that you have to stick with, and you can certainly pull from others and not include all of one. But this does give us a good starting point. So we'll start with the developable area, and as explained by Mr. Martin and his team, this includes these sewerability areas. So when you're looking at sewerability on the west side, one, Lower South Elkhorn, up at the top, Ironworks Pike, and then all the way down to Blue Sky, all around the clock here. These are the developable, we've identified the developable areas based on the floodplain, the parks, PDR, those kinds of inputs that then tell us within these geographic areas, how much area of that is already dedicated to some other source or some other use, such as a natural feature or a policy such as parks and PDR. And so on this table you can see the gross and the net acres. Those were presented last week as part of the study, but it shows how much of the land is developable based on the removal of those other things. And so we divided that up into three categories. If the developable area was less than 50% of the total area, then that received only 1 point. If it was between 50 and 3/4, then we got 2 points, and if it's 75% to 100, it received 3 points. So that starts to show that areas that have the least restrictions have the most developable area and the most likelihood, at least under this category, of being successful for development. Roadway frontage was one of the council criteria. They specifically said existing frontage on corridors, arterials, collector roadways, plan for growth along major transportation, federal highway corridors. So we put that matrix together as well to show our collectors and arterials, our state roads, and our interstate roads. And all but one, and that's number 9 over here, meet the criteria of road frontage. So only one of these for road frontage loses points. Council also said that the parcels should be contiguous to the current urban service area. So we looked at contiguity, and most of them are contiguous, but the ones that aren't, certainly, the ones out here on the outside, Avon, and some of these down here in the east, at this time are not contiguous. So based on our scoring, they lose a point. Everything else gains a point. PDR impact. As Beth told us last week, we know where all of our PDR farms are. We know where applications are. And so we know what we're trying to protect from a PDR standpoint. So we looked at all of these sewerability areas to determine whether there was any PDR in them in the first place, if they were adjacent to PDR farms, which would be outside the sewerability area, if there was only one PDR property in the sewerability area, or if there was more than one. So you may recall that part of the goal of the Rural Land Management Board and the PDR program is to create clusters of farms. And so getting multiple PDR farms together helps to achieve that goal. So that's why the multiple PDR, even if it's just 2, you're starting the formation of a cluster, and those score better for other farms coming in. So for purposes of our scoring, we scored those the least. We had them lose points. If there was one PDR farm, it lost 1 point, and then if there was no PDR, if it was not adjacent to the PDR, it got a point. Specialized areas, this really is just one. It's the Royal Spring Aquifer. It is in area number 5 up here. It does not show up in any of the other sewerability areas, so we identified that. That was both brought to your attention by PDR and water quality, so we just took away a point for the Ironworks Pike area because it was in the Royal Spring Aquifer. And as a reminder, that is the recharge area for Georgetown's water supply. LFUCG participation. This is really related more to cost and what, at least at this moment, based on the criteria we have before us, what would it cost to sewer these areas? And the sewerability study breaks that down into very high, moderate, minimal, and not required. And so we assigned points based on that and showed, so for instance, the Childsburg Walnut Hill, number 9, you recall earlier, that didn't get any points because it was not on a transportation corridor, but because it requires the least amount of LFUCG participation for sewage, it scores well. So, you know, there's a yin and a yang to these as we go around. But this is the scoring was based on the cost, and so the higher number means the lower the cost at this time. Now there are also some other considerations, and we've marked this on your table in gray, and we got some asterisks also. And perhaps Mr. Martin could help talk us through this just a little bit more.
The three locations that are highlighted, number 2, number 6, and number 14, they're highlighted for that reason because there's going to be some level of LFUCG participation in those areas anyway. We've got consent decree issues that are right along the existing urban service boundary that we need to deal with. So when we reflect LFCCG participation, that one's not voluntary. That's going to be a mandatory situation. I didn't cover the asterisks. The asterisks are there because areas 7 and 8 are impacted by what decisions are made in 6. So, for example, if you don't do 6, but you try to do 7 and 8, high very well could become very high, and minimal could move to high for those two areas because they're dependent on that downstream infrastructure for Area 6.
Okay, and then finally, we have parcel size. And we know from our experience in planning that parcel size absolutely matters for the type of development that you're trying to achieve. So for instance, Fayette County Public Schools won't build even an elementary school on anything less than 15 acres. And we know that larger parcels are desired by Commerce Lexington when they're marketing properties for economic development purposes. So we took the parcel size from the suitability study and broke that down really into 3 categories, scoring 2 of them. So if the area has at least 50% of its parcels that are less than 10 acres in size, then that area loses a point, because we know that those are going to be much more challenging to redevelop. It's very likely that those smaller parcels are individual homes and may not want to redevelop at all, and certainly building something for larger scale residential or commercial development would be a challenge. So those areas lose a point. Anything between 10 and 40 acres is kind of neutral, so we did not assign that a point. Those could be good parcels. They may be encumbered already, so we did not address those with any points. And then anything greater than 40 acres, that's really where we're going to see our biggest benefit as far as developing for economic development, for any large-scale housing to meet affordable housing needs, and so they received an additional point for that. I guess only one of our areas looks like received the negative point, and again, that was poor little Charlesburg. They keep showing up on ups and downs here. Everything else you can see there that has larger parcels received the point. So once we've done this, these are the areas that we scored, and again, they address what the council directed as far as looking at transportation corridors and recognizing the agricultural integrity and the infrastructure, and that's where the sanitary sewer study comes in. So we put all of these together, and we get a total score. And so that allows us then to start ordering these by how, at least based on this analysis, these areas would fare for future development. And so the top 4 or 5 or so, you can see area number 3, Man of War, area 10, Athens Boonesboro, area 2, Mint Lane, area 6, Royster Road, area 9, Charlesburg, Walnut Hill. And just so you'll know, where there's a tie score, like number 3 and number 10, they're listed simply by their order. So Man of War isn't better than Athens Boonesboro. Athens Boonesboro isn't worse than Man of War. They're tied, and so they're listed by their area number. And then all the way down onto Old Frankfort Pike, really scoring the lowest and the least candidate, perhaps, for the type of urban development that the council has asked for. And again, as Charlie said, some of these could change depending on what decisions we make. For instance, if we bring parcels that lost points because they were not adjacent to the urban service area, or sewerability areas that lost points, might then gain a point once we make a different decision. But in looking at this, we don't believe that this order will change drastically. This generally is the area where we believe that, based on the analysis, based on the requirements of council, and based on the recommendations, that these would be the likely areas where we would want to start considering a new map for urban development. Mr. Chair, that concludes this presentation. We will be glad to take any questions, comments about this, or anything else that would kind of catch us up. But as I said, we are also prepared to start looking at maps and start showing what that might look like in a new urban service area.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Questions from Mr. Duncan? Yes, Mr. Phillips.
You mentioned that the city has laid out these requirements and identified these particular areas of interest. Was that a limitation of areas of interest, or is that, in other words, are there other areas of interest we should be considering, or are these the only ones we're allowed to consider?
Mr. Phillips, going on what the council, you said the city, but it's the council that directed this through the goals and objectives. They were specific. They could have said, expand the urban service area to meet housing and economic development needs and stop there. But they weren't. They went on and gave a specific range of land, so 2,700 to 5,000 acres. They described very particular issues such as contiguity, frontage on corridors, common ownership, transportation, infrastructure, and agriculture. So we believe that they had the opportunity to tell us what the priorities were, and that's what we're going to apply to this exercise.
I understand that that's City Council's priorities, but are there other considerations that we are allowed to take into to factor in? I mean, for example, transportation, refuse removal, various impacts on travel or traffic. Those, I issued a letter to you on that. Thank you for the response, by the way. But those seem to be also criteria that are pertinent to this process of where and how much. And in other words, are we prohibited from considering those things?
Mr. Phillips, I wouldn't say you're prohibited, but some of the things you're describing will be addressed through the master planning process. So as land uses and zoning and infrastructure is more particularly laid out through the master plan, then those kind of questions will be addressed during that year-long process.
That is after the fact that we have identified how much and where.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now I'm on. When I look, and I don't think these pages are numbered, but when you ranked these or scored the LFUCG participation, were there different elements that all came together on that, or could you name what that included?
Typically, typically, pipelines alone cost the least amount of money. When you start involving pump stations and storage tanks, then the cost starts escalating dramatically. If you have an alternative that considers a treatment plant, then it really goes off the scale. And so when we tried to, excuse me again, when we tried to characterize these things as minimal up to very high, that was usually the driving factor. Does it involve a large pump station? Does it involve a large storage tank? As you recall from my discussion last week, is that we're not suggesting that we put wet weather through the existing system and try to deliver it to the plant. Instead, we talk about building storage tanks adjacent in those areas. Basically, a storage tank's $1 million a gallon. So if you build 25 million gallons of storage, that's $25 million right there, and you haven't even begun to build the pump station or the other infrastructure. So a lot of times I think you'll see, if you look behind the curtain on this, is that if it involves a pump station and storage tanks, it pretty much gets into that high range.
But it's all related to sewerability. So no other LFUCG considerations, or when does that come into play? Like, for instance, the roads, fire, police, when does that happen? I mean, I guess what I'm saying, that really changes the scope with costly additions.
And yes, Councilmember Plowman, as Mr. Phillips and I were just talking, that some of those elements will be presented during the master plan to talk about what it would take to provide other government services Not only those, but parks and other community services such as schools and libraries. All of that would be part of the community facilities analysis during the master planning process.
Does that come with a consultant, or is that something that'll come to us?
The consultant will help with that, yes.
Okay. Will we have input? Or
Well,
we will get a presentation showing what that is?
From time to time, yes. We've built in some presentations by the consultant, updates throughout the consulting process, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Director Duncan. Can you, I think you all talked about it maybe even in the first meeting, can you give us a reminder about gross versus net area?
Gross is the total acreage within an area that's been drawn based on contour lines. Developable, we have subtracted out parks, floodplains, rural residential, which we define to be 10 acres or less, assuming that there was a house there, not absolute, but assuming that, and PDR. So basically, that left a amount of acreage that we've considered to be reasonably developable.
Director Duncan, how would you interpret, because I don't think it's necessarily clear in the charge of the council from goal 3, how would you interpret when we say 2,700 to 5,000, are we talking about gross or net?
Vice Mayor, I actually have I hope that the committee will accept this answer in the spirit that it has been thought through, because we have discussed this and how we would recommend that you approach this. So if the committee's desire is to create a new urban service area on the low end of the council recommendation at the 2,700 acre, we would recommend that as much of that as possible be developable land. So if you end up with 2,700 acres, but 300 of it is floodplain, we would recommend finding some more land to make that up. However, I don't believe you have that option at the 5,000 acre end. So if you were to push closer to 5,000 acres, then whatever is floodplain or constrained or otherwise not developable is just part of that top number.
Okay. And then there are a couple other things that I've thought about that, I understand the way you all kind of created all these metrics based primarily on what the council has charged you all to do in Goal 3. The couple of things to me that are most sort of concerning and not in here, and I'm thinking back to 1996, honestly, in terms of identifying land and then how much of the land years later, decades later, get developed. Is there a way for us to know, on some of this land or these parcels, like, are these landowners willing to sell? Are we going to identify a bunch of land that just gets sat on for another 20 years? Do we know which areas or which parcels people are eyeing for either sale or development?
Vice Mayor, if you'll let me walk into that answer. From the first urban service area in 1958, there is still land that is in agricultural use. And only recently, the Fritz Farm and the Summit and the Mahan property nearby over the past 15 years or so developed, and that was all part of the original urban service area. So it can take a long time for property owners to make a decision that they want to do something different besides agricultural on their property. And we saw that certainly in 1996. We still have several hundred acres of property that are being farmed that we have been hoping would be developed because they were supposed to be. So perhaps that's a long way of answering. You're getting to the answer is that no, we don't know that if every parcel we identify will be attached to a property owner who is willing to develop either now or within the next 5 to 10 years. We don't know that.
Okay. And then do we have data, and would this be a map that we could also build within this context of what of these areas that we're considering are adjacent to existing, current, or near future development in terms of kind of just thinking holistically about, like, To me, it makes the most sense to create expansion areas near areas that are developing either residential, commercial, industrial, whatever's happening. It makes sense that those are the areas that probably will continue to grow.
Yes, I would say, Vice Mayor, that can be one of the inputs that Chris Dorridge can show. Certainly, an aerial photo shows what development is already there and what kind of stub streets and other infrastructure might be available. And in addition, we can also tell you if we know of a development plan that is active for an area that may not have been built yet, but that we expect to come in the next few years. So that kind of information can be available, yes.
Okay. This might be a question for the chair. For something like that, if for example, like I would love to see that particular information built in either just for information only, kind of to show us where those areas are in relation to this map, or even making it part of the scoring rubric, making it part of the, like, if it is adjacent to current developments, existing developments, that we rank it as part of this criteria. If we wanted to do that, is that something we just ask planning to create, or is that something we need to vote on as a body?
No, I think that would be something we can request depending on the time, right, Mr. Duncan?
Yes, Mr. Chair, this is certainly not something that we could necessarily show you today. However, we have the aerials, so we do know where existing development is and what potential connection opportunities exist and where they don't exist. And whether we have the current layer of development plans, I don't know. We'd have to kind of rely on our memory on that. But I would say, Vice Mayor, that if we were to start a process of a map, and then one of the inputs that the committee wanted to see when they reviewed that, pick that up again next week, was that information, we could certainly have it available by then.
Okay.
Is that satisfactory to you?
I think so. I would love to see that particular element be part of an additional map, and I'm not sure how the scoring would work, but for me, that is also part of the criteria in my mind of, what is most developable, what is most likely to be chosen. So I would love to see that.
And Vice Mayor, I know you didn't ask this, but part of the master planning process will look at opportunities. So, for instance, if some of the land that this committee recommends and the Planning Commission approves does not connect well to an existing development, then that would absolutely inform the type of land use that is applied to there. Perhaps it wouldn't be as appropriate for a residential development because it doesn't connect in, but it might be more appropriate for an industrial use. And so whether the development connects or what's happening next to it is important to know, but there are options for that land if there are other constraints exist. So that would certainly be something we work with the consultants through the master planning process.
Okay. And then lastly, when this gets handed off, when we identify X number of acres and this gets handed off to the consultant to create this master plan, will they have the ability or authority to reduce or possibly even increase the size of the acreage that we've selected, or do they absolutely have to work with the exact acreage that we gave them?
Well, what's going to happen, Vice Mayor, is that you're going to make a recommendation first to the Planning Commission, and then they're going to tentatively accept an expanded urban service area for purposes of master planning. I would think the Planning Commission would like the option to have to have some flexibility with that, because through the master planning process, through fine-tuning with the sanitary sewer inputs, we may see that it makes sense to move this way or that way. But ultimately, it would still be a recommendation from the master plan consultants. The Planning Commission would still make the final decision.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, two questions, and I don't know about the scoring piece of this, but just in terms of seeing the lay of the land. In previous work, we saw a map that was not land that cannot be conserved, it was land that cannot be developed. And it included things like government ownership of property. It included, it had rural settlements, it had rural neighborhoods, it had all the other things that are already out there that complicate what we're looking at. And I'm wondering, can we at least get a visual on what this looks like? And I don't, whether we factor that into the scoring or not. I'm not suggesting that now, but I think for all of us to see what's already out there, there's more there, I think, than we think there is. And the second question, really, Charlie, is directly to you in terms of what you said to us last week about our treatment plants. And looking at our top scoring areas, the ones that are scored 10 and higher. We talked about the fact that Town Branch isn't certified. We talked about West Hickman's capacity, a lot of capacity there. Thinking about these 4 areas and where the sewage would go, and the other piece of that down there in our treatment plants actually in Jessamine County. And as I recall, we have an agreement with Jessamine County that we're taking their sewage. So how do you envision, at what point have they given us everything we can accept or that we've agreed to take? And how would that factor into our ability to, am I making sense here? Do you understand what okay.
Yeah, I think so. Let me answer the Jessamine County question first. We have an agreement with them that will accept up to 2 million gallons a day on an average day flow. The treatment plant's rated for 33.8 million gallons a day, and we're averaging about 19 or 20 right now. Jessamine's probably about at the halfway threshold of that 2 million gallons. So if they ever wanted any more, they would have to come back and get an amendment to the resolution that drives that agreement. So I'm not too concerned about Jessamine's impact itself. I did look at these areas here to see how they would flesh out. On my little amateur scoreboard, I came up with 6 of the 7 that he did. Basically, it's the distribution of dry weather flow is pretty even between each plant because of the geography that's involved. It'd be about 4 million gallons a day for increase for Town Branch and about 3.6 for West Hickman. And that both of that keeps us under that threshold that I was concerned about as far as us pushing over the 95%. It's kind of ironic that it worked out that way by accident, but I was somewhat relieved. Again, what I said last week, though, is that's dry weather flow. Any wet weather flow that we have to accommodate for any areas that are added, that it needs to be managed in that area, not conveyed to the treatment plants.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Phillips.
Yeah, I want to follow up a little bit on that, on wet water events and the relationship to Jessamine County. I know we still have some cross connects. You guys have done a wonderful job sort of sorting out the issues with high water events and capacity. Topographically, are there areas which would present greater concern to you from a water event issue and an overcapacity issue than others, given this list?
Well, it goes back to what I said before about some of those areas, I have to remember my numbers here, 2 and 6. We've already got existing upstream wet weather problems there already. And so, whatever infrastructure got put in those areas, if they were added to the urban service area, would have to account for that, in addition to allowing for the aging of that system that naturally happens. What I said last week was that we're going to be smarter about it and plan for the aging of the equipment and build in more extra capacity for those wet weather events so we don't end up back where we were 15 years ago.
Does that mean we're anticipating greater costs in those areas should that area be developed and hypothetically exacerbate there with hard surfaces, exacerbate the rain event issue?
Well, when we're talking about sanitary sewers today, so, I wasn't really figuring in impervious area and stuff, because you're right, the stormwater management aspects of it will have to take care of themselves, just like they do in our current urban area. Every time somebody decides to pave something over, it's the fact of urban presence. But in the sanitary end of it, what we're proposing is what we suggested in the sewerability study, is that we build the facilities such as that it can handle a peak wet weather flow that's consistent with the existing urban area, because that way we don't put ourselves in a box somewhere down the road. Yeah, that will be a cost. Maybe we won't build it right away, but we're going to plan for it. Thank you.
Not seeing any other questions, Mr. Duncan, at the moment. Okay.
Mr. Chair, if you'd like, and I believe in response to some of Ms. Worth's concerns about other on-the-ground features that might inform our decision-making, if you'd like, we can start the mapping work on this and show what we have available, show where we have some additional constraints that we would want to consider before making a decision, and then start seeing how that might fit together. Not expecting that this group would make the entire map today, but I think it would be good if we could get started on that and sort of get in a groove. And when we come back next week, perhaps look at trying to finalize that map before then getting a good draft ready for the public input meeting. And if you would like to do that, then where would you like to start that work?
We might need to take a recess for that one. I'm seeing heads. I'm okay with it, but I don't, I just want to see the heads nodding, not nodding. Questions? Okay. Let's move on then.
Mr. Chair, if I could recommend, and I'm just recommending this because I think it's one that would be a purposeful exercise. It will show how we intersect with some other constraints that we want to address. It will also allow us to look at what does a large area look like when we start including that as part of the urban service area. So my recommendation is that we start with area number 6, which is the Royster Road, and see that because that is one of our largest areas, and it does score well. It's in the top 5 of areas that meet the criteria. And so with Chris Dorge's input, we can start looking at that and seeing how that might form an additional X number of acres to the urban service area.
Okay.
And Chris is sitting in the back, and he's got a microphone, so he can address any questions you all have. You can't see his face so well, but please feel free to direct anything to him. So Chris, if the group is all right, we'll start looking at, I think when I do that, yeah, that number 6 right there.
Okay. So, Mr. Duncan, is Chris going to narrate this, or you're not?
We can try to do it together if
Do
you
it
don't
together.
mind. Yeah.
All right, that's fine.
So
Chris,
could you give us the road
I
boundaries?
was just about to ask if Chris
That-
could particularly Royster Road, that's in the vicinity.
On the eastern side is Royster Road. From I-64 down to Winchester Road. Winchester Road over to near Hume Road at the urban service area. And up Hume Road back to I-64.
So the portion, and Charlie, help me with this perhaps, the portion, I don't think this works on this screen. So the portion between here and here, what is that? Okay.
Charlie, return your mic on, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, forgot about that. I was more worried about his pointer, about whether he needed a pointer or not. Basically, I think that is no man's land because we don't have any service there. Where you talked about it, where it's Hume Road, we actually have a pump station. Can I get up? It'd be easier. We have a pump station located roughly about right there, right across from where Polo Club intersects with Winchester Road, and it pumps over to another pump station that we have over here. So there's the boundary, as I understand it, goes there. So this area right here would actually be part of Area 7, the way that we evaluated this. But what Jim mentioned earlier,
excuse me, you can always massage these boundaries a little bit. You know, we're trying to follow contour lines. And this contour line, I'm sure, goes in this direction, not in this direction, which is why we drew the boundary the way we did in the first place. But you could always add that little sliver, provided that the sewers were deep enough to be able to provide it with service. But right now, like I said, we have existing infrastructure here, and it stops here. When the water wants to flow, that you can kind of see in the background, there's the stream. And then we also have one over here, roughly at the entrance to Greenbrier. And it wants to go this way, but because the urban service boundary stops there, that's where the pump station is.
So, a reminder, it's on here, you just can't see it, but this blue line, Chris Dorge, is Royster Road. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And it happens to also be the northern eastern boundary of this sewerability area as well. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, sure. So, Chris, let's turn on the PDR layer and see what that shows for this area. So again, I-64, Royster Road. We've got PDR property adjacent on the other side of Royster Road. Not in Area 6, but in Area 7. Chris, do you have the rural settlement layer also? And if not, we'll just point that out. I think this is what Ms. Worth, one of the things she was talking about. So this is Columbus, Uttingertown rural settlement. One of 14 or so settlements in the rural area that are historic for a variety of different reasons. And they have been studied, and they are called out to be valued for their historic significance. And so I would, just as you would consider a PDR farm, I think we'd want to consider what we do about the rural settlements as well. Can you turn the floodplain on as well, Chris? Andy, did you have something for me or for somebody else?
Jim, can you talk a little bit about the PDR farm? Is that, what is that being used for? And then since you did turn on the floodplain, what does that mean? Does there have to be buffer around that? How does that interpreted?
I cannot talk about the PDR farm, but if Beth or Ms. Martin have specific information about this one, I know they'd be happy to share. While they're deciding whether they do, I can tell you about the floodplain. The first thing is you can't build in it. So the floodplain remains as it is, so it would not be a developable area. And we do have buffers and setbacks in our zoning ordinance for development around the floodplain. However, the floodplain, it doesn't mean you can't cross it. You can still build an appropriate crossing, and it can absolutely be used as part of a greenway. So it can be part of an open space greenway system, a trail system, something to that effect. So it's not lost land, but it's something that you would want to consider in the master planning and how you incorporate that as a feature and not something that takes away.
Director Duncan, my question has to do with the rural settlements or hamlets that are out there. How did you come up with 14? Because of a project I'm working on, we have 24.
It may be, council member. I'm just remembering back from '07 when we did the analysis. There may be more, but we've got them all mapped in here. I know there are a number of them. You're right, though.
And when you say they're protected, is that buffered?
No, they're not protected. There's just recommendations on how they should be treated for future development. So, for instance, parcels. The recommendations are that they not be consolidated or further subdivided, that they remain in their more original layout as well as use. In some instances, there's urban zoning on some of the rural settlements, and so that permits some business uses as well.
Thank you.
And Director Duncan, I've got a couple of different questions for you. On the map, there's a wedge of RSA 7 right near where 64 and 75 intersect. How are these areas determined? I'm always curious when I see weird shapes, you know what I mean? That the way they're cut.
Charlie, I'll give a stab. The sewerability area is determined by topography.
Okay.
So where does the land lay, and where does it break, and how does the water flow?
Gotcha. Okay. And then, did you all consider the floodplains as a part of your criteria or scoring?
It's part of you'll notice in the developable versus not developable, the net and the gross, they are taken out for net purposes.
Gotcha. Okay, so it wasn't a scoring, but that's part of what makes the difference.
Right, so if
between
it
the two
reduced the
measurements.
area to developable, then yes, it could have affected its score, yes.
Okay. And then I want a little bit of clarity for myself on how buffer zones work. So let's say we expanded into this area 6, and let's say a developer wanted to build right up to that PDR farm. Do they, as a developer in their development plan, have to create a buffer zone? Like, how does that work?
Well, first of all, they wouldn't be immediately adjacent because there's a road that separates them. So that buffer of a road already exists. It's a property line, so they'd be on this side. That is where, Vice Mayor, I believe the master plan would then make recommendations on how do we address development in the vicinity of lands that are protected, whether it's a rural settlement that's not protected or a farm that is protected. So that would come out during that process. I'm sure that the Rural Land Management Board would have input on what they felt was an appropriate buffering for the PDR farms.
Okay, so for buffering, there's not a hard and fast rule of X number of feet from, the farm, things like that?
Well, no, because there's not any urban development right now around PDR farms. But there is a buffering around the urban service area, the existing urban service area. So that could be applied, just default right here, or the master plan. But I would expect the master plan would make specific recommendations when situations like this occurred and the PDR farm was in the vicinity.
Okay, so those the buffers from all the preserved or protected areas are always in consideration, but most likely in the master plan part of this process?
Yes, that would be something we haven't really had to deal with before, is how do we deal with urban development next to a PDR farm? So we would expect the master plan to provide guidance on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Jim,
yes,
my
yes,
bell's
please.
coming up, yeah.
Who's this? All right, thank you. All right, so to answer, okay, I'm Beth Overman, the PDR director. To answer Ms. Johnson's question, so this farm is around 315 acres. It is being used as a cattle farm and crops. It has been in the same family for over 100 years and also has an historic house on it that is protected in our easement. This is a horse farm that is around 200 acres. Both of those have federal easements on them. So.
And if you can't see, there is a property line going down there, so the two different parcels.
Is the rural settlement, is that part of the gross or the net?
Do you know if, Charlie?
I'll confirm this, but I would believe that it was deducted from the gross and not reflected as developable.
I have a question on that, on the settlements. According to the Rural Land Management Plan, they do get into detail on that, I remember. I don't know if I can ask someone that was on the plan, that worked on the plan?
Yes, they are described in the Rural Land Management Plan. The study was completed in the early 2000s, and that was incorporated into it started in the Rural Land Management Plan, then it was further studied and has been updated in the Rural Land Management Plan. So yes, the rural settlements are addressed, yes.
I think we can find out more there.
Yeah, Director Duncan, is there a way we can get on this total score sheet at the very end here? I would love to see one more number, and that would be the percentage of developable land per area. Because, you know, I see all these numbers and stuff, but I'd be curious to see, like, if we had an area and the non-developable land was like a high percentage, that to me would also impact, you know, how we look at this process.
If our team is clever, they could probably put that together before we
Yeah.
finished up today.
I was thinking I could do it myself on my phone, but it would take a while. And then, kind of piggybacking on Councilmember Plomin's question about hamlets and settlements, those are not technically preserved or protected areas, is that correct? when it
That's
comes to
correct.
development?
That's right. But they are called out in both the comprehensive plan and the rural land management plan, so they are noticed and have been, are recognized as cultural features in the rural area. So I believe we would absolutely want to make sure we consider those as important features when we're thinking about expansion.
Okay, so where would that consideration come into play? Would it be part of this expansion master plan, or would it only come up when developers have development plans that involve or encroach onto these areas?
I would say, so just as an example, and again, just as an example, but if we were to use this area in its entirety as expansion, the staff would recommend that you draw this out, and that the rural settlement not be included. Because once that happens, you end up with places like Bracktown and Cadentown that are in the urban service area now and are no longer rural settlements for that purpose. And places like Jonestown off Tates Creek Road, which have all but disappeared. So we would recommend and look for ways to bring the urban service boundary in the vicinity and then work around that so that this does not become urban land. And then the same thing as we were talking about buffering PDR through the master plan, what would be an appropriate way to ensure that we have buffered around the rural settlements.
Okay, so that's something that this committee can determine if we decide we want to bring in.
We would recommend that the rural settlements not be brought into the urban service area, yes.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Director Duncan. So, you know, thinking about the rural settlements and a way to protect them without penalizing or adding burden onto the property owners, is there a designation that exists in our zoning that we could recommend for those areas, or is that something new that we could talk about creating with a designation to protect those areas?
Councilmember Brown, this is something that's been talked about for about 15 or more years now. When UK did the study of the rural settlements, there were recommendations at that time that either some sort of historic overlay or neighborhood development overlay be applied. And of course, the good thing about that is it does. It helps freeze things in time in some respects. But then that can also be a double-edged sword. If part of the recommendation of those settlements is that they remain vibrant, and that they would be places where households would want to move into, to build new homes, to build their generational activities there. So in some respects, I think it's good that we haven't settled on what protections we need, because I think we want to make sure we don't lock it down so much that those properties essentially become useless. But yet we still want to recognize their historic significance and find some way to honor that while allowing them to be viable properties as well.
So thank you. I appreciate that answer. So if we don't include them in the urban service area and leave them in the rural service area, does that prohibit us from rezoning those hamlets going forward? Say some work is done and comes up with a recommendation. Since they're in the rural service area, does that keep us from rezoning them?
Well, I'll give a more nuanced answer, Councilmember Brown. It means that they would not, the comprehensive plan would not recommend a zone change for that, and therefore the staff would not recommend that to the Planning Commission.
Okay. Thank you.
Director Duncan, do you know what the total acreage is I don't know, of the rural settlements outside or inside or out in the RSA?
I do not, Councilmember, but I believe with Chris George's help, we could get that information.
I think that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, Vice Mayor.
Director Duncan, Are these rural settlements, excuse me, already factored into the not developable area in these numbers?
Charlie said they were, yes.
Yeah, we tried really hard to attain the goal that I think you were talking about earlier, is that if we're going to present an area as potentially be developable, that it is in fact developable. We couldn't identify each individual property owner's desire to sell or not sell, but these other things, because they were small, or they're parks, or they're floodplains, the likelihood was so minimal, don't stick that out as a teaser, so to speak.
Gotcha. So if we were, for example, to bring in Area 6 minus that rural settlement, it would impact our gross developable area, but not the net, because it was already taken out. Is that correct?
Yeah, the gross is not the gross developable, it's just the gross area,
Gross, yeah,
everything.
gross, yeah.
And then the net is what we perceive to be the developable.
Okay, so that rural hamlet is already not within that developable number.
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Ellinger?
Dovetailing off of what the vice mayor said, just looking at what you all came up with, the total score, could you put into the map at some point just where they rank in that? Because I just did it myself, and it kind of gives you contiguous areas that are ranking high, and just by, not that this would make this process real easy, but if you just took the top 8, that'd be 4,505, and it'd be 3,762 on non-developable. So you can look where we kind of stand on what the high ranking, but if you could actually put the areas, what they rank, I think that would be helpful for everybody.
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
Mr. Phillips?
We're talking a lot about net and gross, which is important, but I want to understand that the notion of buffering, whether it's PDR or, for example, perhaps buffering around these hamlets, that would all come out in a subsequent process, not to be calculated really here. So in other words, we could include it as it might be developable, but subsequently identified as a buffer area, whether it's PDR, farms, or a hamlet.
Yes, that will be identified in the master plan, yes.
Okay, any other questions?
So, any other layers we need to be looking at, like government-owned or other things there, existing development, that would keep it from development?
Chris, what else do you have handy that might help inform this decision?
Chris, would you want to throw on the aerial photography? This would give an idea of just what has been developed out in this area.
Some small lot subdivisions here, certainly along Hume Road, WKYT, I think they're right there. Chris, do you have a layer of publicly owned land in your?
I don't have it readily available. We definitely can get it. We just
Okay.
don't have it available for
Okay.
this presentation.
Yes, Mr. Johnson?
Director Duncan, based on the look of this aerial and something that Charlie had mentioned a while ago, I think he called it no man's land, with that floodplain running out of no man's land, Charlie, does that make that area sewerable into Area 6 if it were considered to be part of Area 6?
We believe it can be done. You know this, is that a lot of times how well placed and how deep the infrastructure is how far you can cross across contours and stuff.
Right.
But yes, I believe that it can.
Okay.
Chris, can you easily cut this piece off here and give us a calculation, leaving in this and then perhaps that as well?
It'll take just a minute.
Okay.
Director Duncan, since we're in this space, is it possible to go beyond and look at 7, right across from 60
Absolutely.
Just because we're in the general area and just understanding why it didn't score the area that's contiguous.
So we've gone to the sewer map here. So in this version of the map, here we are in 7. So here's the boundary between 6 and then 7 coming out here and around. So in this version, the yellow represents PDR. Pink is rural residential, so large parcels of subdivision. So Andy, this is part of these colors are the reason that this is not scoring well. You've got a lot of land already claimed by PDR in the area 7. And then some of this other large lot as well.
What about the part that's just, so it sort of creates a little down below 6, right in that area?
This?
Yes.
You've got, and that's where certainly a scalpel could
Okay.
potentially work, just as Charlie recommended here. I'd certainly want his input on what the effect of taking that for sewerability purposes. You do have some, looks like lots that are already divided, but you've got some larger parcels as well. Charlie, what can you say about just sewering of this part?
You know, we were over there talking before, again, we were drawing on contours, not necessarily property lines, and property lines will change this to some degree. I think that the portions of this that are large enough could get in here. The drawback is that you'll have to go across those small parcels in order to get there, as far as a gravity sewer, and that's part of the things that we kept talking about when we mentioned Charlesburg before. That's one of the big drawbacks on it. It's fairly easy to sewer, but you have to go across the state lots to do that. And so you start questioning the likelihood of that actually happening.
So are you anticipating then, Charlie, with your answer on that if this area was considered, those lots that you would have to cross wouldn't be brought into the urban service area? And that wouldn't be an opportunity to put those on sewer rather than septic?
Whether or not they're brought into the urban service area wouldn't necessarily be my call. My thing would be is that if we're doing area 6 and I'm dealing with my Greenbrier problem that is a consent decree issue, I'm going to try to make an informed decision about whether or not I'm sizing this such as that this could come in at some point in time in the future. And typically we try to do that. We try to plan for the future because you're going to only get one swing at the plate.
Right. I may have misunderstood you. I thought you were saying that because you would have to run from like area H and G through F over into area 6, crossing those property lines was a problem.
No, I think what I was trying to say, and I may not have said it very clearly, is when we were looking at 7 as an aggregate.
Oh, gotcha.
You've got these different colored parcels. When it started turning something than white, then it starts scoring less because it's got those impediments, I guess.
Understand. Thank you.
Director Duncan, on if this committee wanted to start kind of chopping up these areas, like looking at that little corner, for example, would you all have to basically run that specific area through all these metrics again and kind of re-add them, reconfigure them to the score sheet?
I think, Vice Mayor, that this was considered the starting point, and from then on, the committee gets to kind of push and pull where they want to. This is just really a way to get us launched.
Okay. Can we also, while we're kind of looking at different areas, I would love to see areas 3, 10, and 2, the other highest scoring areas.
Okay. And Vice Mayor Chris, do you have that first work done on Area 6?
I can't do the two at the same time.
Okay, then take us over to area 3.
In the interactive map or the PDFs?
Can I ask one more question about 7 before we leave this? Where does Avon, the facility, belong on that map?
It's much further out. It is in the Avon Extended, which would be Area 8.
So Vice Mayor, you said area 3.
3 and 10 and 2, which is
Okay.
Man of War RSA.
So 2 and 3 would be together. Chris, if we could, there, oh, okay.
Ms.
Oh,
Worth,
yeah.
just for discussion, this is 8 here. And it said you're way out here. You've got, again, a lot of those different colors and stuff like that, which, you know, intuitively explains why it probably scored very low.
2 and 3, yeah. This version's fine. So you got 2 here, then 3 there. So this is where we are in the urban service area. Dunbar High School is down here. Yeah. There, yeah, there's Dunbar. Dunbar High School, Man of War Boulevard, Dunbar, and then this is area 2. Rural residential is what we've got labeled here. Otherwise, there's not PDR or rural settlement in this area. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, since this one's my map, it's probably easier. You do yours and I'll do mine. We'll tag team on this one, yeah. Dunbar High School right here. This is the existing Mint Lane pump station. Has been there probably since Beaumont developed. And this is one of the remaining consent decree pump stations that we have to upgrade. And right now, with it sitting right on the border, that's one of water quality's concerns because we're very limited about what our options are. And so this area 2 was bounded by Man of War, Parker's Mill, Bowman's Mill, and then back around along a contour line, basically splitting the existing farm out there in half. You know, we've talked about parcel lines versus property lines. That will change acreage and stuff if that's the desire that we move more towards property lines than we do parcel lines. As I said last week, you know, we're driven by the contours of the bathtub concept. That doesn't mean you can't move it and adjust those acres accordingly to match property lines better. But in this particular scenario, we only looked at one real alternative, and that's basically moving that pump station farther downstream. And in this scenario, we moved it down to sit at the edge of Bowman's Mill Road. It would require a storage tank to be able to handle the wet weather flow and stuff because you can't convey the existing wet weather flow back to the existing South Elkhorn pump station because it's not big enough to do that. But that is the scenario for area 2. Questions?
That is horse farm, is it not? What's the current use?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's a farm. It has no PDR, and it has just this one area there that is a rural residential parcel.
Thank you.
Which is part of the reason why it scored higher is it has I don't remember what we had it as far as the cost wise, but again, it was driven a lot by our need to participate out there in the first place. I was not as concerned about cost. And then when it came to PDR and some of the other aspects, access to transportation, those type of things.
Director Martin, on, with moving that pump station, does that also take care of Area 3 if we brought that in, or is there a separate solution?
Well, let's switch to Area 3 here right now here. So Area 2 is down here. Upstream from it is Area 3. Here's Man of War. Again, we're kind of cutting a contour and going into the Wellesley subdivision, collecting a little bit of Urban County government property, and then coming along Beaumont back to Man of War. Again, following contours. Parker's Mill, thank you. Oh, Parker's Mill, yes, right through the middle of it, right there. All right, so there's a drainage area that comes down to, on the airport side of Parker's Mill. This would require a pump station and have it pump back and dump into the Area 2, to where Area 3's outcome is largely dependent on whether or not you add Area 2 or not. From our perspective, just water quality's perspective, it's more efficient to have both of them. And if you just gonna have to have one, Area 2, not Area 3. Area 3 alone is difficult.
Gotcha, thank you.
One rural residential parcel. You got these up here in the tip of this. As you mentioned, as you remember from last week, I talked about we account for the flow if they ever want to come in, but we don't account for them as being developable. So again, scored high when it came to developable acres in the percentage wise, because there's very little of the colors. All right. The airport is back here. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's up here, I believe. Question.
Director Martin, what is that the city owns? Is that parkland? Is that at the top of that area? Do you know?
Yeah, that's the Cardinal Run Park.
That is part of the park,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes, Mr. Phillips.
I know it's not to be a factor, but do we have any sense, have you had any sense from parks, for example, like Cardinal One, which I know they are at capacity now, do they have any intention of expanding, or would that be a consideration in again, this net gross issue?
Well, Cardinal Run is just getting launched, so it will be developed over the next couple of years, I guess. So it's not developed right now. I believe an option like this would give the city, a consideration like this would give the city more options. First of all, we can only access Cardinal Run through Parker's Mill.
Right.
But for instance, if this was part of it, perhaps you would build access from Man of War instead, and therefore Cardinal Run would be more. It'd be safer to get in and out of, first of all, and could be more purposeful as a citywide park.
Have we solicited any input from them on that? Because I know that at one time we had all sorts of big plans for that area, and it kind of tanked for a while.
Right.
But have we solicited their input on that? Any of the park, in any of our areas?
Not for the expansion, no. That would be part of the master plan, absolutely.
Area 10, coming from town, going out Athens Boonesboro Road towards Blue Sky I-75, right there. So this would be on your left as you're coming outbound on Athens Boonesboro. You can see Brenda Cowan Elementary School property is sitting right in the middle of that. Right now, basically farmland. We looked at one alternative, and that was basically to have a pump station located somewhere down here along the edge of the road, and then bring gravity into that. This gravity would have to be deep because the water wants to actually go across the road, but we drew the boundary to where it actually stopped at the road because we felt like that was probably more practical from in terms of developable acres. Again, the school, but otherwise no PDR, no small rural residential properties, fairly straightforward. The connection point for the pump station would be the existing pipeline that comes from Blue Sky that we built about 2014. And we do believe it has sufficient capacity to be able to handle that additional flow.
Could we get an aerial view of that?
Mr. Martin, I had a question too. Is that pump station behind the Wendy's still in operation?
Yes, sir, it is. We, through an agreement with the property owner, they converted it from a treatment plant into a pump station and connected to that very same pipeline from Blue Sky I mentioned before.
Okay.
Chris, can you pull this down just a little bit? So if you've seen these maps before, you'll notice this is sort of the beak or the nose of the urban service area where 8th and Spoonsboro and I-75 come together, the Childsburg development over here. And in the evaluation, Charlie has both of these, most of this area covered, but there is this part up here that is not part of the sewer ability. So I think we'd want to hear if Vice Mayor, if there was interest in looking at this, I think we'd also want to talk about what's possible here too, so that we don't end up leaving an isolated piece that really would not serve any purpose at that point, because there are not good connections. There's pedestrian connections through a trail, but there's not good vehicular connections into this area. It'd have to come from down here. So we'd want Charlie's input on how we incorporate that into this if we were to go in that direction.
And Director, that area that you just identified, that's not one of the areas, it's not identified on our map, is it?
It is not. It's not part of Charlie's study area.
Okay.
Yeah, again, we started with a 2006 study that defined certain areas for us, and so we followed those. Again, following contours. That's not to say they can't be added. If you add that property we were just talking about up here, it wants to go in this direction. So if you add it, it's either going to have a pump station, or somehow we're going to have to figure out whether or not there is existing capacity in the existing neighborhoods that are adjacent to it. It can be done. It's just we didn't consider it in this because we were trying to look at which bathtubs can we serve.
Yeah. Well, I think if we're going to talk about it, we probably ought to add it to one of the areas if we can, and maybe it's more appropriate to add it to 12. And then I was going to, that's just a suggestion, but do what you think's best. And then I was going to ask Chris, is there a layer for rural activity centers?
There is. I'll turn it on now.
So Blue Sky in the yellow.
How does Charlie, in regards to sewerability, how do rural activity centers play into infrastructure and how you think about flow with sewers?
This might be an easier question for Jim. He's going to have to help me with this because basically we're operating off of a footprint that was provided to us. That this boundary is the service area for Blue Sky. There's an existing treatment plant. There was an existing treatment plant that we took over in the aftermath of the consent decree, and we converted into a pump station. But we've not talked to anybody about adding anything. Everything that goes on is within the existing parcels that are within the existing Blue Sky footprint.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chair, I offer a suggestion, and if this is not where the committee wants to go, that would be fine. But if you'd like, I believe Chris Dorge, working with our team, could put together the maps as we were starting to do on number 6 and show acreage, sensitive areas, cultural resources, those kinds of things that the staff might recommend that we want to treat differently. And perhaps have those ready as a starting point for the next meeting rather than trying to build those here. Although Chris is very clever at doing that. We can do some of that here if you want to, but that's just another option.
No, I think it's a good option. And then as a committee, do we want to kind of take the top 5? Or it seems like those are the ones that came up more than anything. And just focus on those areas? Instead of, we sitting here with, I don't know how many we have, a number of areas, but it seems like that's the hot topic, right?
I might suggest, Mr. Chair, just for planning purposes, even though 9, we kind of kept going back and forth to that, it just doesn't get us a whole lot, even though it does score well. And that perhaps would be one that we could bypass for now, but the top 5 would be 3, 10, 2, 6, and 12, and perhaps considering what Councilmember Brown just said about expanding into 12. And here's 9, it's all 10-acre lots. And so that's not to say that you couldn't do that, but you're just not going to get much out of that for development purposes.
Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson.
As part of the consideration, I'd like to go back and consider the area in Area 7 south of Winchester Road that we talked about on that drainage area.
That one space that we were talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So this area you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then I presume
I thought it was that
this area
Yes,
as
sir.
well?
Yes, sir.
For those 2, okay. Yes, Ms. Johnson.
Is it possible, if you all are doing the work, if we went ahead and looked at 13 and 14, just to have that consideration, understand how that all connects? And it may be a situation where it's more of a scalpeling in that area.
Absolutely.
Chair, I got more and more requests. Can we move over to area 3? I want to see what the Rural Activity Center layout looks like over near the airport. Without the word Bluegrass Airport.
And
No,
Councilmember,
thanks,
if Chris's layer is like ours, the Rural Activity Center is smaller than the footprint of the airport property. What we're showing is the Rural Activity Center as it was identified decades ago. But the airport has acquired more property since then.
Okay.
Anecdotally, I will point out that we have 3 pump stations located on the airport's footprint right now.
All right. I'm good. Thanks.
You okay? All right. Mr. Phillips.
Yeah, just a clarification on that. I refresh my recollection. In order to do Area 3, did you need Area 2 essentially, or do I have that backwards?
Area 3 drains to Area 2. If you did Area 3 alone without 2, you'd have to pump it someplace different. And in pumping it someplace different ends up increasing costs.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Okay, thank you. I just got those confused.
And Area 2 already has consent decree problems and needs work anyway, right?
Well, it has this consent decree problems immediately upstream from that boundary, existing boundary.
Mr. Chair, I have as our task to prepare for you all for next Tuesday, to work up the maps, acreages, and show the features for Area 3, 10, 2, and 6, and 12. And then to ensure that we have added portions of Area 7 along Hume Road and south of Winchester Road to Area 6, and then to also work up Areas 13 and 14.
That's my understanding as well. So let's move forward with that, because we needed to exclude some of these.
And I'd like to, let me also ask Chris Dorge, is what we described something that we can do in the next few days? Okay.
Okay, is there any other questions? Yes, Mr. Johnson.
I was wondering if we might get today's presentation emailed to us. If it was emailed to us, I don't think I saw it. I can go in and look. But if we can get that to us, that would be awesome. And if this can be done in the next few days, this work, if it could be emailed out in advance to our next meeting, that would be wonderful too, for us to kind of take a look and be able to consider. I think it'd save us some time.
We're under some pretty tight deadlines. We will get this to you and up on the website immediately for today's, depending on how quickly we can turn around something we feel confident in, and we don't want to give anything incorrect in this. So if we can, we will get it out to you beforehand, for sure.
Okay, Mr. Duncan. Don't see any more questions or concerns or additions, so thank you.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the input from the committee.
Oh, man. So, Mr. Duncan, is there any other business you think of?
Chris Taylor, do we need to cover anything else today?
No, Chair, I don't believe so.
10 o'clock next Tuesday.
That's what I'm talking about. Well, this meeting's adjourned.